over the last 3 decades, the Science Book Prize has become a major event in the Royal Society's calendar. It's certainly one that I personally look forward to. And none of this would be possible without the kind help from our sponsors over the years, including our current sponsors, Insight Investment, the support of publishers, and of course, many of you who are gathered here tonight. And I'm particularly pleased to say that the relationship with Insight Investment, which has seen the prize go from strength to strength over the last 3 years, has just been confirmed for another 3 years. And Insight Investment, and particularly David Chalou, are great partners to work with because they share our passion for science writing and science books. Now, science, I've always said science is an integral part of our culture as much as arts, literature, or music. It's really one of the great triumphs of human achievement. But communicating the wonderful advances of science and all of its triumphs to a wider public is also an essential part of our culture. And all of us really need to share in the amazing creation of knowledge that science represents. Part of it, there's also practical reason. A lot of science is funded by taxpayers, and really it's the job of scientists and science communicators to ask, why should the taxes of somebody working away, why should some part of it go to fund science? And it doesn't always have to have an immediate practical application. It could be, the public, as far as all the people I've talked to, are perfectly happy with the idea that we're generating wonderful new knowledge. And some of that knowledge inevitably leads to applications down the line. There is another reason also for us all to be scientifically aware, and that is we're living in an increasingly technological world, and decisions are being made every day that affect us by governments, by corporations, by other organizations. And all of us really need to know the basis of these decisions. And I think that's another reason why we all need to be more aware of science. And of course, science writing is a big part of that. Because in fact, science books help foster that understanding. Most of us don't have the expert time or the expertise to read specialist papers. In fact, if truth be told, many of us don't have time to read specialist papers even in our own field, let alone in other people's fields where we don't understand them. And so it's really through popular science literature that authors can engage us, they can weave a narrative, use analogies and anecdotes to bring together complex ideas and expose us to diverse areas of science to all of us. Now, as always, this year we have an amazingly diverse range of subjects covered by our shortlisted authors. And before we announce this year's winner, tonight we'll be hearing from all of them in discussion with our evening's host, Professor Brian Cox, both about their books themselves, but also on what makes inspiring science writing and what motivated them in particular. Now, finally, before handing over to Brian, I'd like to thank this year's judges who have given up a lot of time to read a great number of books and who've had the difficult task of choosing the 2018 shortlist and winner. So I'd like to just mention them, and if they're here, could they please all stand up? So the chair of the judging panel is Dame Frances Ashcroft. Professor Lee Fletcher. Greg Williams, who's the editor of Wired magazine. Vivian Parry, who I don't believe is here, and Peter Florence. Thank you. So now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Brian Cox for what I'm sure will be an interesting evening.
Thank you, Venki, and thank you all for joining us here at the Royal Society and, of course, online. I will be the host of tonight's proceedings. I am the Royal Society Professor for Public Engagement in Science, and I've been involved in this prize for a long time. The first time I got involved in it was when I was nominated back in 2009 and didn't win. So I know I share your pain, authors, and I don't know what it's like to win it, so I don't share your relation. I'd also like to echo what Venki said, to thank Insight Investment. This is a tremendously important prize. It gives a platform to all the books that are nominated and all the books that we represented tonight. And as Venki said, I think science writing is increasing in importance in our society. So this is an extremely important thing to do. So I'd like to echo my thanks to Insight Investment and also to the judges. I've also been a judge on this prize, actually, and which is a wonderful thing in a way because you get to read so many great science books, but you also get to read some not so great science books. And when a box of 80 or 100 books lands in your office, in fact, in my office in Manchester, I still have some of them from 2010, I think, which I have only glanced through that didn't make the shortlist. So thank you, judges. This year's shortlist explores ideas which some of them seem everyday in a sense, but they each go much deeper to teach us about the science. They give us new ways to look at the world around us. They range from the precision engineering and complex computing that makes modern life possible to groundbreaking research into how our brains and immune systems work. We're also given a new appreciation for our relationship with animals and the narratives we use to explain their behaviour, and a re-conceptualization of the solvents, solutions and substances that make everything possible from a glass of wine to flying a plane. So to reimagine our world through these new concepts takes intelligence and imagination in equal measure. I feel immodest now because I said I was nominated once. So this means I must have had intelligence and imagination in equal measure at some point in my past life. I haven't been nominated since. I should say I've lost it. So very shortly we'll be meeting our 6 shortlisted authors who all display both these qualities, and we'll be asking them what inspires them to write. Now, also, if you're watching on the live stream and would like to ask a question to the panel, please do tweet. The hashtag is #SciBooks, and we'll try to find time to ask your questions to the panelists as well. So now let's take a look at the 2018 shortlist. Exactly How Precision Engineers Created the Modern World by Simon Winchester. Liquid, The Delightful and Dangerous Substances That Flow Through Our Lives by Mark Miodownik. Hello World, How to Be a Human in the Age of the Machine by Hannah Fry. The Beautiful Cure, Harnessing Your Body's Natural Defences by Daniel Davis. The Unexpected Truth About Animals by Lucy Cook. And Inventing Ourselves, The Secret Life of the Teenage Brain by Sarah Jane Blackmore. So please give them a round of applause, and I'll welcome the authors please to the stage. So we're going to start by asking each of the authors to read a short excerpt from their books. So perhaps we'll start with you, Simon Winchester.
Okay. The context for this is that the closing chapter of the book is about metrology, the science of measurement. And I went to a number of places, including the Metrology Institution in Beijing in China. And the place where they're doing all the research into the nature of duration or time and measuring the second. Outside it, there's a grove of apple trees, with one of them in particular that they cherish. And I just wanted to read a tiny bit about that. And I gather, because we don't have to talk about ourselves for 30 seconds, that we can have 90 seconds to read from the book. give or take?
Go on.
Okay. So the one apple tree that was given to the Beijing lab by the National Physical Laboratory here in Teddington is called the Flower of Kent, and it produces apples. But the thing about it is not so much that it produces nice apples as its pedigree, because it was a relic, the tree that is in Beijing, of a mighty tree that had been blown down in a great historic storm that had devastated a country estate a little further north of Teddington, and that of Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire. And Woolsthorpe Manor was the home of Sir Isaac Newton. It was to Lincolnshire that Newton had fled from Cambridge in 1666, and it was here during the summer of that annus mirabilis that he famously observed the apple falling from the tree. It was here, and from wondering of the force that might have impelled the apple's fall, that he came up with the notion of gravity as a force that affected both this humble fruit and, by logical extension, affected the constant motion and altitude of the moon in orbit around the planet Earth. So Isaac Newton's apple tree, or more properly a child descendant of it, now flowers and fruits in a Beijing garden beside where the Ming emperors once buried their dead, where one can see the Great Wall running along the mountain ridges, and where China's latest generations of scientists are confirming their intellectual ambitions by working out with the greatest accuracy the effect that gravity has upon the steady beat of time.
Mark Mead-Dubnik.
I thought I'd just start at the beginning because probably like 90 seconds. Just because I suppose a lot of us, I'm sure, you rewrite and write and rewrite that first paragraph, don't you? So let's just see if it was worth it, shall we? I've had peanut butter, honey, pesto sauce, toothpaste, and most painfully, a bottle of single malt whiskey, all confiscated at airport security. I inevitably lose the plot in situations like this. I say things like, "I want to see your supervisor," or "Peanut butter's not a liquid," even though I know it is. Peanut butter flows and assumes the shape of a container, and that's what liquids do, so peanut butter is one. Even so, it infuriates me that a world full of smart technology still can't tell the difference between a liquid spread and a liquid explosive. Although bringing more than 100 millilitres of liquid through security has been banned since 2006, our detection technology has not improved much in that time. X-ray machines can see through your luggage to detect objects. In particular, they alert security to suspicious shapes, distinguishing guns from hairdryers, knives from pens. But liquids don't have a shape. They just take the form of whatever is containing them. Airport scanning technology can also detect density and a range of chemical elements, but here again they run into problems. The molecular makeup of explosive nitroglycerine, for instance, is similar to peanut butters. They're both made from carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, and yet one is a liquid explosive, while the other is, well, delicious.
Hannah Fry.
So despite the fact that my book is about algorithms, I've chosen a bit which is not about algorithms at all. But anyway, I just quite like it. Okay. In 2015, a group of pioneering scientists conducted an unusual study on the accuracy of cancer diagnosis. They gave 16 testers a touch-screen monitor and tasked them with sorting through images of breast tissue. The pathology samples had been taken from real women from whom breast tissue had been removed by a biopsy, sliced thinly and stained with chemicals to make the blood vessels and milk ducts stand out in reds, purples and blues. All the tester had to do was to decide whether the patterns in the image hinted at cancer lurking among the cells. After a short period of training, the testers were set to work with impressive results. Working independently, they correctly assessed 85% of samples. But then the researchers realised something remarkable. If they started pooling answers, combining votes from the individual testers to give an overall assessment on the image, the accuracy rate shot up to 99%. But what was truly extraordinary about this study was not the skill of the testers, it was their identity. These plucky lifesavers were not oncologists, they were not pathologists, they were not nurses, they were not even medical students. They were pigeons.
Daniel Davis.
Okay, my book's about the immune system. It happens to be about the thing that the Nobel Prize was won today, but I'm going to just read a bit of the book that I particularly like. Science is many things. A method, a journey, a route to power, a body of knowledge, a thing you loved or hated at school, a jigsaw puzzle with an infinite number of pieces, a force for good and bad which has produced both food and bombs. Arguably, its greatest success has been and will be for some time to come in curing diseases. Still, our body's own remedy, the immune system, is far more powerful than any medicine we have devised. Most germs are tackled by our body without us hardly knowing. Over many decades, we have begun to unpick how this works. By testing what happens when one type of cell is missing or is in abundance, when a gene is inactivated or enhanced, when a chemical pathway is switched on or off. Step by step, with an occasional misstep, we have uncovered many of our immune system's secrets. But like the solar system, the financial system, any big system, the immune system remains enigmatic. All the theories have cracks in them. Each idea only works in certain situations. Everything is only some kind of an approximation. I and thousands of others continue to devote our days and lives to solving the puzzles that remain. Someday we may find a grand unified theory of the immune system, a few principles that capture precisely how it all works, or one diagram that fits on a t-shirt. But that dream may never work out, and it might even be the wrong thing to aim for. In the near future, irrespective of whether or not we can describe the system in simple terms, we may be able to make predictions about one's health by taking a few precise measurements, a detailed analysis of different blood cells, say, and plugging that information into a mathematical or computational simulation in the same way that mathematics provides the only way to describe how light behaves. In the meantime, using the knowledge we have now, we can make smart lifestyle choices and create new medicines to fight infections, cancer, autoimmune diseases, and other such maladies. But death will not be eradicated, and paradise is not promised. From here, we must step forward carefully, thinking deeply about what we set out to treat. Not all deaf people want to join the hearing world, and how shocking it feels now to know that in the UK in the 1950s and 60s, homosexuality was seen as a condition to be treated with the female hormone estrogen or electric shocks. Science is many things, but there are some things it must not be. It must not be the pursuit of any supposed perfection in the human body.
Lucy Cook.
So a bit of context for this. It's the end of the 18th century, and an Italian Catholic priest come scientist with an absolutely fantastic name, Lazzaro Spallanzani. He could have been a Bond bad guy in another world. He's trying to get to the bottom of fertilization, and he's doing so by studying frogs having sex. And he can see that the female's doing something, he can see the eggs coming out, and he's assuming that the male is doing something, but he can't quite work out what it is because it's invisible. So here we pick up. Spallanzani suspected he must be contributing something to the process, he just needed to find it. To do so, the enterprising Padre borrowed an idea from a French scientist, René Antoine Furchut de Rumeur, who 30 years previously had gone to great lengths to hunt for whatever substance, if any, a male frog emitted during copulation. This he did in the most ingenious fashion, by forcing the frogs to wear homemade amphibian underpants, which served as a form of full-body prophylactic. Fortunately for Spallanzani, and for us, this fastidious French scientist kept meticulous minutes of the various prototypes for these pants. On March 21st, we put on a pair of pants made of bladder, Rumeur wrote in his notes. Very tight pants that sealed off the hind end. The animal bladder was a winning suit in that it was nice and stretchy and easily slipped on the amphibians. But once the frogs got in the water, it became too soft and floppy and started to disintegrate. He wasn't sure if the frog was adequately covered, so these original organic undies were scrapped. Wax taffeta, a waterproof material used to make umbrellas, proved a more durable choice. Unfortunately, it lacked the necessary elasticity to ensure a snug fit. With palpable frustration, the Frenchman noted, "Having made the pants and put them on, the frogs abandoned them in front of me." The leg holes he'd made were too big, and much to his dismay, the frogs could remove the pants by pushing their legs up through the holes and jumping clean out of them. Reaumur was nothing if not resourceful. He resolved the issue by bespoke tailoring the pants with tiny braces that slipped over the frog's shoulders and held the get-up snugly in place.
Sarah Jane Blakemore.
This is from the first chapter. When I tell people I study the adolescent brain, the immediate response is often a joke, something along the lines of, "What, teenagers have brains?" For some reason, it's socially acceptable to mock people in this stage of their lives. But when you think about it, this is really strange. We wouldn't ridicule other age groups in the same way. Perhaps part of the reason why adolescents are mocked is that they sometimes do behave differently from adults. Some take risks. Many become self-conscious. They go to bed late, get up late. They relate to their friends differently. We now know that all these characteristics are reflections of an important stage of brain development. Adolescence isn't an aberration. It's a crucial stage of our becoming individual and social human beings. I find teenage behaviour fascinating, but not because it's irrational, inexplicable. Quite the opposite, because it gives us an insight into how natural changes in the physiology of our brains are reflected in the things we do and determine who we will become as adults.
Simon, if I could start with you. You've written many books, actually, from oceans to explorers, inventors, but this particular book is about precision. So why did you choose that subject?
I think, first of all, my father was a precision engineer. He made tiny electric motors for the Royal Navy for use in the guidance systems of torpedoes. And he brought home one day, I remember, a box full of what were called Joe blocks, Johansen blocks, which are used by engineers to calibrate micrometers and things. And he put one on top of the other and asked me to pick up the upper one. And I couldn't, because it adhered with immense strength to the one underneath, even though they weren't at all magnetic. And he said that they did that because they were incredibly flat. So the concept of perfect machine flatness, I mean, I think I was about 8 years old when he showed me that. And then when I was about 30 years old, and I was working for the Sunday Times, I did a story which involved great luxury, driving a Rolls-Royce from the westernmost point of Europe to Astrakhan in what was then the Soviet Union. And to pick up the car, I had to go up to Crewe, and I saw an elderly man just finishing a crankshaft which he had made and was beautifully polished with chamois leather. And he said this thing was so perfectly balanced that if you put it between two bearings, this enormous piece of steel, there was no one side of it was any heavier than another that would cause it to slow down if you started spinning. And so it would, in theory, spin forever, but for friction. And I think those two things, perfect balance and perfect flatness, stayed with me. And then in about 10 years ago, someone wrote to me and said, why not write a book about precision, this invisible thing that is so crucial to all our lives? And remembering those two things, I thought, why not?
I think that's an interesting point you make in the book, that it's something that's invisible, the precision that underlies a lot of the things we take for granted, mobile phones onwards, is invisible to us. We don't pay attention to it.
No, I mean, the iPhone now has a chip, an A11 chip, with 4.5 billion transistors. And the transistor was only invented in the 40s, and it was about the size of my hand. And now they're so tiny and so precisely made. I mean, the most extraordinary takeaway statistic, I think, from what I learned when doing the book, was that there are more transistors working now in the world than there are leaves on all the trees in all the world. Yeah. I mean, these things are so tiny that how do they operate at a sort of atomic level? So it's a fascinating topic, I think.
Yeah. Mark, if I come to you, your book is it's an unusual style that you've chosen to write the book. It is a journey. It's almost like a fictional book, but it's not a fictional book. So why did you decide to use that framing?
Well, partly because I wanted to embody the liquid state in the kind of book. It needed to flow. So I wanted each chapter to bleed into the other. And at one point I wasn't going to have any chapters. It was all just going to be one thing. And my editor backed me away from that. But it's probably the correct decision. But this journey of flow is really important to me. And secondly, I want my book to be read by the 95% of people who are not really interested in facts, who want a good story. Ultimately, they want an entertaining read, and this can be as entertaining as any fictional story. It just happens not to be fictional, and that means it needs to be a rollicking, good page turner. And people like stories, right? So I had to have a good story. And airplanes are dangerous, and they check you for explosives. What better way to start?
You said actually in the passage you read about peanut butter, and you said it's not a liquid, actually it is a liquid. But can you just define a liquid?
Well, there isn't a very good definition of a liquid. I mean, there's no hard and fast definition of a liquid. So things that flow into a container and take the shape of a container are defined as liquids. But you can put cats, in fact, there's a whole YouTube channel about cats in containers, and they do take the shape of a container. And by that definition, a cat is a liquid. So that
is a cat a liquid? No. But people always say glass is a liquid. Is that?
So, I mean, people would say it's not as liquid as
liquid.
I mean, it's got an amorphous structure, so that's the same structure as a liquid, but it won't flow over any human timescale. Whereas the tar on the road is flowing now, today, and even though that seems very solid, it is a liquid. So usually time is the thing that stops it. So the crust of the Earth is flowing now, but very slowly. The mantle underneath it is flowing faster, 10 millimeters a day or so. So, the whole planet is fluid in that sense. And so it's always about what timescale you're looking at something as to whether you really want to call it a liquid or a solid.
Yeah. Hannah, so algorithms and AI. I mean, AI in particular is something that I think fascinates and concerns people in equal measure. We hear a lot about it in science fiction.
Yeah,
so what are the elements that people get afraid of that you think are reasonable to be afraid of? What does science fiction get right, and what does it get wrong?
So I think that science fiction is a really good place to explore that kind of dystopian future when artificial intelligence is just as smart as humans are. And I think that that's a really important contribution to the kind of general discussion. It's important that we think about that stuff. I think one of the things that is slightly unfortunate about the way that science fiction deals with artificial intelligence is that the AI tends to be able to do what it says it can do, right? It kind of works without breaking. And I think that can sometimes paint a slightly false picture of what real AI is like. So, I mean, for example, you have sort of films where you have facial recognition and then you hone in on this person and then, you catch a criminal. There is real facial recognition, on the streets, the police use it. It has a 98% fail rate. And I think that, sometimes I think science fiction can give you that false image of just how far we are down this road of AI.
Why did you decide to write this book?
So this is something that has been brewing for me for quite a long time. When I was doing my first postdoc in this kind of area, so I work in complex social and economic systems, I'd been doing some work with the police after the 2011 London riots, trying to sort of predict how rioters moved around the city and what drew them to certain areas. And we published this paper, and I went off to go and do a talk in Berlin about it. And I was really naive and really silly, and just made loads of jokes on stage and was like being really stupid, dropping some lols and stuff. And I just was being quite flippant about the research. And it hadn't occurred to me that if there is one place on earth where understanding what it means to live in a police state, where they really understand that, is in Berlin, of course. And during the Q&A, I literally got torn apart, right? It was horrendous. But at that moment, I really kind of realised that I'd been thinking about these mathematical systems that were embedded in the real world without really thinking about what the wider implications of it were. And when I came back to London and kind of continued working, I've just noticed there's been a few different times where colleagues of mine have been, creating algorithms for police, for healthcare, for all of these different systems, and not stopping to think about the kind of moral implications of their work and really the dangers of kind of, being involved in that. That's why I wanted to write this book, to sort of join up those two things, the people who are having algorithms done to them and the people who are creating them.
Actually, Daniel, I know that you, in the passage you chose to write, that you chose a moral message or a strong moral component at the end of it. Was that, for you, also a reason for writing the book?
It is true that I think one of the reasons to write the book is that the immune system is the part of us which we maybe understand the deepest, so we can dig into the details the best. And there are some issues from those details that do relate to how we live as a society, and perhaps more. I mean, it is difficult to bring morals out of the science. But it is true that that was a motivating factor for me, because one of the things that I think isn't so well known is that the great tragedies in history have Holocaust and slave trade have come from a misunderstanding of the differences between people, and right now we still have a problem with understanding the differences between people. And one of the important facts that come out of our understanding of the immune system is that the greatest genetic differences between people have nothing to do with physical looks. They have nothing to do with our skin colour or our hair colour or our eye colour. They come in the immune system. The immune system is by far the greatest genetic differences we have. Even more powerful than that is that we need those genetic differences to survive against all different kinds of infections. So in fact, the ultimate celebration of human diversity is right there in the immune system. And so that is something that I think is quite profound. And I do feel like that was a really important part of the story I wanted to tell. And there are other examples like the part I read out as well.
You mentioned that we have quite a deep and deepening understanding of the immune system now scientifically. I suppose it's one of those things that there's a lot of colloquialisms surrounding it about it. Well, it's the thing that attacks invaders, or it's the thing that's our body's defense system. So everyone feels they know what the immune system does. Is it much more complex? I suppose it is the answer, but
it always is. I mean, if there's any take-home message of all of science, it's that nothing is simple. It's one of the.
Yes.
So it's certainly true that at a very rough first approximation, our immune system works to fight off what's not part of you. But it only takes a moment of thinking about it that can't be the whole story, because the food we eat isn't part of us, but you don't really want an immune reaction against that. And more subtly than that, there are bacteria that live within our stomachs that are very important for us, and we have to make an immune response against bacteria which might be dangerous and not harm bacteria which might live with us and be part of our well-being. So actually, it is incredibly complex. And it's only relatively recently that all these details have unraveled. Since I start the story in the book from 1989, and it, roughly speaking, over the last few decades, all this whole canvas of a multi-layered tapestry of cells and molecules and genes and proteins that all amount to this very complicated network that is able to respond with the right kind of response to something that might be dangerous and not, for example, attack bacteria that are in other situations a germ, but in some situations really help us.
Yeah. Lucy, so your book, it's got a panda on the front, which is a cute animal. We tend to anthropomorphise animals in that way, so we can identify, I suppose, with I suppose that's why the publisher or you put it on the book.
They've got their own chapter, so it wasn't that shallow.
But why do we do that? What is it about humans that wants to, that falls in love with some animals and really doesn't worry too much about other ones?
My book's about animals, not about humans, although it is sort of about how our relationship with animals. So I can only, I sort of feel that we must be a very insecure species. And I sometimes think that being the most intelligent life form on this planet is a very lonely place. And so we're constantly looking for our reflection in the animal kingdom and constantly looking for reassurance about ourselves and how we should behave. And you know, so we're looking to animals for the answers, but we also, at the same time, we impose ourselves upon them as well. And I think that's really where we've made some of our worst mistakes, is by viewing the animal kingdom through the prism of our own existence and imposing ourselves on them, and even worse, imposing our morals on our moral values on animals, which are often wholly inappropriate.
And it's full of wonderful stories. You demolish some myths, but tell more. I suppose the point of the books, tell more wonderful stories. The one I loved, the story of the swallows. I think was it that they were just watching them behave. People thought they hibernated or even were born underwater. They were
yes.
Aquatic, semi-aquatic animals.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's what I did. Just love digging up all these sort of crazy old myths that we thought in the past, and that is true. One of those was debated at the Royal Society. In fact, was a propagator of this myth. In actual fact, that swallows hibernated underwater like fish. It was an obscure Swedish priest in the Middle Ages who started this rumor. And he was the author of an encyclopedia that did terribly well because it told stories of mice raining from the sky in Norway and giant sea creatures in the sea, and so people loved it. But he also said swallows hibernated underwater, and I think it's probably because swallows are seen gathering around reed beds before they fly off. So he thought that they were gathering and then that they went underwater, and that was widely believed. And for 300-400 years, that was what people believed, that they did so, to the extent that a number of experiments were conducted in order to ascertain whether this was true or not. And there was a chap called Charles Caldwell, who was an American, who attached ballast to swallows' legs and chucked them in a river. They died. They didn't hibernate. So yeah, lots of crazy things.
I suppose it does reflect the difficulty of observing animal behaviour, doesn't it? You think?
Exactly. I mean, it's very hard to figure out, but you'll never know. We'll never know for sure whether your dog really is guilty, but I suspect it isn't.
Sarah Jane, the teenagers, you mentioned it again in the passage you read. We all feel it appropriate to pass judgment on their mental state, and for some reason, what are the big misconceptions that we have as parents or as a society surrounding teenagers?
Yeah, teenagers have generally a bad reputation. This is nothing new. They have done since people started writing about teenagers, this age group. For example, back in Socrates and Aristotle wrote about them. In fact, I was going to try and remember the quotes, but I know they're in the first chapter, so I can read quotes if I can find them, Socrates. He says, so 2,500 years ago, Socrates says, the children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders and love chatter in the place of exercise. He's very cross. And then Aristotle, he has a whole passage about them, which I won't read, but he says they are lacking in self-restraint, fickle in their desires, passionate and impulsive. This is exactly the way we stereotypically describe this age group today. Nothing really has changed. You can see other quotes by Shakespeare and lots of literature write about this age group in that kind of negative, mocking, demonizing way. Is it a misconception? I mean, in some ways, these stereotypical behaviors are based in some kind of reality. That there is lots of evidence that adolescents take more risks than children or adults. Not just adolescent humans, but also adolescent animals. All animals go through a period of life between puberty and becoming fully sexually mature, and you can measure their behavior and see that they increase the number of risks they take, they explore their environment more, their social behavior changes. There was one study showing that adolescent mice drink more alcohol when they're with other adolescent mice, and that's not true for adult mice. So that there's some truth in these stereotypical behaviours that we apply to this age group. But of course, it is a stereotype, and that misses the vast individual differences. Not all adolescents take risks. Not all are influenced by their peers. Some are, some aren't. And it also misses the point that this is a really fundamental, important period of biological and social and psychological development that we have to go through in order to develop a profound sense of self-identity and particularly social self, how other people see us.
And is that, it occurs to me that you mentioned that you see this kind of behaviour or transformation in other animals. So do we understand much about the evolutionary drivers? It seems that it's something that's necessary, otherwise that behaviour wouldn't present itself. So.
Yeah, I mean, mice and rats only go through adolescence for about 30 days. So it's not as extended and protracted period of development in most other species as it is in humans. In fact, even the great apes only go through adolescence. It's a far shorter period of their lives than it is for us. We're the only species who undergo this very, very long period of development where we are gradually becoming independent from our parents and independent from our families. That's what adolescence is all about, becoming an independent adult. And it takes a long time to establish yourself as an independent adult and learn about your very complicated social world around you, the social hierarchies, and find your way in the world, learn by risk-taking, by trial and error. This takes a long time for us, and it takes a long time for our brains to develop.
Yeah. I wanted to open this out. We'll go to questions in a few minutes from the audience, and I'll have a quick look at Twitter as well. So if I go on my phone, I'm not being rude. I'm trying to see if anything's on the hashtag. But I thought, Hannah and Daniel, you've already touched on this, about the importance of science books, and Venki mentioned it in his introduction. I wonder whether anyone had a comment on whether you felt that one of the motivations for writing your book was that it is important for science books and popular science writing to be out there, and if so, if you could reflect on that. Maybe Mark or Simon.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I want to echo what Venki said, which is that science is part of culture. And in some ways, it needs to kind of be recognised and be more part of the discourse. And books are one of those very intimate experiences of culture, aren't they? You can, with headphones, listen to a piece of music and you really feel it. And I think reading a science book is the closest that science becomes to that experience. It's you get inside the head and you can live and breathe it for months on end. And I think that's the only bit of the science communication where you get that, and I think that's a really important part of it.
Simon, I suppose you're more of a generalist, actually.
Yes, I suppose so. I once read a book about the Oxford English Dictionary, which is 90 years old this last August, and I was interested in the English language because it's invisible. We take it for granted. We don't think about it too much, and yet hugely important. And similarly with precision, I think it's there. All around us, has been since it was born, and there is a very specific date it was born, which was the 4th of May, 1776, which I didn't realise this, but May the 4th is Star Wars Day. Yeah. As in, May the 4th be with you, so it's a very appropriate day. And I liked writing about something which is, as it were, to use the cliche, hidden in plain sight, but is hugely important, but generally not thought about and not recognised. And I will say that in America, where I live, I'm not sure whether the situation is mimicked in Britain, but the number of bookstores is increasing. I think 350 new independent bookstores opened last year. Book sales are up something like 17%. Science books are particularly important. So this whole idea that we're thinking in tweets and short pieces of communication, I think in America today is changing rather rapidly. And so an important subject, visible hidden in plain sight, but being read about in book form, I think it's a welcome development.
I can't allow you just 30 seconds. You have to say how on May the 4th, 1776, precision was invented, unless you want to say by the book.
No, I don't want to say that. John Wilkinson, made a cylinder for James Watt, which fitted perfectly, because James Watt couldn't make cylinders properly. He made them by hammering iron into a circle, lowering the piston into it, and steam went everywhere. So the early steam engines that he made were woefully inefficient. But then Wilkinson worked out a way of making perfect cylinders that kept the diameter of the bore straight the entire way down the shaft. The piston fitted perfectly, and no steam leaked, and essentially, after Watt ordered 500 of these cylinders from Wilkinson, the Industrial Revolution was off to the races. So it wasn't simply the birth of precision, but it was the formal start date of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to comment on the importance of science writing, or no?
Well, I would. Just quickly. I mean, I think that science is hugely important to our culture, and that science communication is, honestly, from my perspective, completely booming. There's so much going on. Like, you can sell out an arena, right? That's crazy. That's unprecedented, right? Hannah, Adam Rutherford do radio programs. Robin Ince does, mixes up comedy and science. Mark Madovny all over the place, right? It's booming. It's booming. I mean, it's booming. But the thing is, books have a really important place in that, because you really can. It's an intimate experience, as Mark said, and you can dig into the details like none of those other great media things can.
I know, Sarah Jane, this is your first science book. I think that's unique on the panel. I think everyone else has written, but there will be authors or aspiring authors watching. How did you? There's two questions really. Why did you decide to become a writer, and how did you find that process of writing your first book?
Well, it's my first sole author book, because I did write a book with Professor Uta Frith, who's here, about, 14 years ago or something, on the learning brain. But yes, it was the first time I wrote a book by myself, and it was a very different experience writing without Uta's brilliant help and her very experienced writing style. So I found it. So when I wrote the book with Uta, I thought, after that book was published, I thought, I am never doing that again. That was so hard and took such a long time. We missed about 5 deadlines imposed by our publisher. And then it's a bit like childbirth, where, a few years later you forget all that pain, and then you start being a bit tempted to write another one. I think in terms of how I found, so I had, yes, I mean, as a scientist, we get asked to write books quite a lot, and I always said no, partly because I was remembering the pain a bit initially, but also I felt like the field I work in, the adolescent brain, wasn't quite there yet, and I hadn't been doing enough, I hadn't become established enough in that field to write a book until about 4 years ago, when I thought, actually, there really is now a huge amount. This field has expanded so much in the last 15 years. There's a huge amount of work. We now know a great deal about how the adolescent brain changes, whereas we knew nothing at all 20 years ago only. And I felt like, I also had, my group's research had grown enough to be able to write it down, and there was so much interest from teachers and parents and teenagers themselves about what's happening in the adolescent brain. I thought, now is the right time to do it. And how did I find writing it? I mean, I find it really hard to write a book, because I'm not a natural writer. I think I can write, scientific papers in my sleep, because I do it so often. That's what I do every day. But writing a book for a non-specialist audience is a completely different ballgame, and I found it really challenging. And I had, huge amounts of help actually from a couple of friends and colleagues who read my book, and also my agent and my publisher who are here. And I couldn't have done it without them, because it's not easy to write, as everyone I'm sure will know. And some people in the audience as well, writing about science for the non-specialist is hard, because it's so much easier to resort to jargon and complicated ways of saying things.
I want to throw it open. I just thought, just to pick up on that, does anyone find it more difficult? Do you find that it enhances your understanding of your science it's a cliche about teaching that to teach it enhances.
Yeah.
Did you all find that?
I think I ended up reading more for this book than I did for my actual PhD. I'm not ashamed to say. But you can't just, if you want to distill something down to a point where it's entertaining, it's a page turner, as Mark said, something that captures the absolute essence of an idea without drowning someone in detail. There's nowhere to hide, right? You cannot just say, oh, and then reference this paper, that's where the detail is. You have to just get to a complete understanding of everything and then crucially make the decision of what to leave out. And that for me is the really hard bit.
So you'd recommend it to scientists because it makes
horrendous.
you a better scientist, is what you're
It's
saying?
horrendous. Don't do it.
Definitely makes you better. I think it makes you clearer about what it is that you don't know. And that's what science is all about. It's what you don't know. And it really clarifies in your head that I don't really know everything about surface tension that I really should know.
Tell us about surface tension. Are there any questions in the audience? So just stick your hand up. There are some microphones that will rove around. Is there no questions at all? Oh, there's one. There's one over there. I'll have a look on Twitter while you're doing that.
Oh, thanks. So it's just to Sarah Jane. I was just going to say, was there a sort of key adolescent trait that you wish we had more of as an adult, or we kept as an adult?
It's such a nice question. Well, I'm very glad that we don't feel that intense self-consciousness and embarrassment in front of our parents anymore. Most of us don't. I do occasionally. But I think, risk-taking is a really interesting one, because we think of adolescent risk-taking. In my field, everyone worries about it. We worry about adolescents experimenting with drugs and smoking and binge drinking and dangerous driving. Fine, because they aren't very good behaviors to do. But what we forget is that actually risk-taking is really important. It's a really important thing to do in our social lives, in our professional lives, in every way. And I don't know about everyone else here, but I certainly took more risks than I do now when I was a teenager. And now I find that I am risk-averse to the point where it's slightly, I don't go and try new things because I think there's too much risk associated with that. Maybe retaining some of that adolescent risk-taking would be good for some of us.
The main tweet I've got here is from Dara O'Brien. He says his book is out this week. He's in a signing in There's one right at the back.
Hello. I had a question for all the panel. What was the hardest page to write? Was it the first page or the last page, or a bit in between?
The hardest page to write, the first, the last, or the bit in between?
Well, certainly with mine, it's always the first page. In fact, the first 5 or 10 pages. And I know all the books that I've written in recent years, I bless the editors for having got through those first 5 pages and say, the rest is pretty good, but junk those first 5 pages and get rid of them and rewrite. And it happened in this book. And it happened in the one immediately before, which was about the Pacific Ocean, and most notably about a fellow of the Royal Society, Joseph Needham, who I wrote about a few years ago. The first pages of that were dreadful and difficult to write. They were stilted, wooden. It was throat clearing. I think that's the thing. That's what they call it. And there's a lot of throat clearing, which a good editor, and one, I'm sure we all agree that writing is very much a collaborative process between the writer and the editor. And in this case, what they do for me is to say, stop clearing your throat and get on with the story. So for me, the first few pages.
Question specifically for Hannah. Your PhD is in mathematics, and you've been working on the application of the mathematics, bringing the mathematical insights into real-world applications and real-world situations. How difficult is it to write about the mathematics as opposed to how the mathematics ends up being used? And in fact, have you been able to write about the mathematics as opposed to the science side of things?
So actually, this is my third book. The other two were much shorter, and on those books I focused totally on the mathematics. And in this one, I just wanted it to be. I think it's a really important subject. Basically, I think that our lives are being increasingly controlled, really, by different algorithms. They're deciding so much of our lives, and I wanted this book to be for the maths to be sort of. I mean, it's all there, right? I mean, essentially, I'm talking about mathematical things, but I don't go into the same level of detail as I have in previous books, and that was a deliberate decision. I mean, there's certain bits where, I talk about Bayes' theorem, or I describe what a random forest is, or, those different kind of things. But I didn't want this book to be crowded by the sort of technical detail, because I know not everyone goes along with that. I know that people have maths phobia ultimately, and I wanted this to be about the discussion of the application of that, really, about how the maths is ending up affecting all of our lives rather than the maths itself. But I think maybe for my I certainly find it easier to write about maths than about this, the wider stuff. So I think perhaps for the next book I'll return to, if I ever do it. God, yeah. No, sorry, torture.
To echo that, and so I had a rule for this book, which was that I would only give the detail if you needed to know it to get to the next bit of the story. Yeah. So I was trying not to, and I have sort of got some diversions, which some reviewers have commented on, but mostly it's like I'm writing this book, but it's a great story, and if you need to know the details of exactly how surface tension work, which you do, it turns out, to understand how a candle works, then I went straight into surface tension, and that was a really hard thing to kind of get enough detail across to understand why it's absolutely vital to have a liquid phase in a candle. It's the surface tension that's making this piece of technology work. But then later on, sometimes the story just works out that you don't need to zoom into everything, and so I just don't. That was just my rule, and I think for a reader, I think that's great. You get a bit of depth when you need it, and yeah.
If I could just add to that, and relating to the question about what the hardest bit to write was. So I think that there are two types of details that are difficult to write. One is the scientific details that you're both talking about, and that the question was on. But it's also about the details of the people who got the work, right? It's also about, and that is really difficult. And I worried about that immensely. So just as one example, so Jim Allison was one of the two Nobel Prize. He won the Nobel Prize this morning for his work on checkpoint inhibitors for cancer, and it's and I write about that in an interview. But it's the if there's been an analysis of how his work, and in fact it builds on the work of 7,000 other people from 5,700 different institutions, and the balance between highlighting one person was absolutely seminal to getting that work done, but there's a community behind that make it all happen, and getting that balance right, how far you dig in. If I just wrote a list of names, no one's going to read it, so you have to pick on the story of an individual. But you can't ignore the fact that there's a huge number of people behind every discovery. So getting that balance right, I found difficult, and I think it's also quite important.
We've got about 2 minutes left, because if I go over time, apparently the press embargo is broken on the winner, and it will be announced to everybody before we've announced it in this room. So I can't go over time. But I just thought, maybe Lisa, I'll start with you. I always, every year I've done this, I've asked everyone what their favourite science book is, other than their own book. So I wonder whether you could start. What was the most, or one of, if not the favourite, then one of your favourite books?
God, well, the first one that comes to mind was my old tutor, The Selfish Gene, by Richard Dawkins. Yeah. It's just a brilliant book. But he's, I think he's gone a little off piece now. I like it when he writes about evolution. He's watching. He gave me a fantastic review for my book, actually. But I like it when he writes about evolution. I think he's a fantastic. He's a fantastic science communicator. I think he makes very complicated things very simple, and I think that's the essence of what is and interesting.
Yeah. Sarah Jane.
I have many, but the one that comes to mind is a fairly recent one by, about 10 years old, by Paul Broks, called Into the Silent Land. And it's about the effects of brain damage on behaviour in patients, and it's unbelievably beautifully written.
Yeah. Daniel?
It's difficult. So A Commotion in the Blood by Stephen Hall is the closest to the topic I've written about, which I know that book's probably about 2000. I've actually read the books on here. I love all these other books. But I think I get my inspiration perhaps more from fiction and science fiction, and Neil Gaiman and Howard Jacobson are the two authors I always say are my favourite.
Mine's got to be Fermat's Last Theorem by Simon Singh, because it's a history of maths, really, told through the sort of narrative of this theorem. But ultimately, it's a really great example of just how human the sort of struggle for mathematical perfection is, and just the limits of human ability and achievement. It's a really wonderful book. I read it about 20 times.
Because it came from the Horizon TV
Did,
show.
yeah,
actually,
yeah,
didn't it,
exactly.
actually?
Yeah.
That is a great book, by the way. And I think that's the book, not my favourite book, which I'm about to say, but that's the book that probably made me think I'd like to write a book, because I was like so inspired by that book. And I thought, there's a story about materials that I need to tell. But the book that I kind of always go back to, and I suppose that is, I can read it again and again, and I have recently reread it, is Primo Levi's The Periodic Table. I just think it's a piece of genius, and it's about life, and it's about culture, and it's about oppression. And science is clearly part of it, all of it, but it's not a science book. It's a piece of literature, and I think once it becomes a piece of literature, it kind of has exceeded its genre. Then it's really something.
And I think for me, The Double Helix, just such a rip-roaring story. I mean, extraordinary. I mean, Jim Watson, who's still alive and kicking in Long Island, I went to a dinner for his, I think, 90th birthday the other day, and there was the book on the table. I mean, he's a bit of an old rogue, and I know, and there's aspects of the writing which is controversial, but I still think it's one of the most exciting scientific stories ever.
Well, thank you all. Thank you. And so now I'd like to invite Venki back to the stage to announce the winner.
Well, that was a fascinating discussion, and I have to say I'm as much in the dark as the rest of you. And so before I open the envelope, I really want to thank David Chilu and Insight Investment again for their sponsorship of this prize. It's been really a great partnership. So I now open the envelope, and the winner is Sarah Jane Blackmore.
Thank you. Wow, I was told, as I expect everyone was, that you should think about what you might say if you win, and I thought, well, I just won't do that. That's too weird. And I also thought there's only a statistically, I think, 18% chance, so I don't think I'll be preparing a speech, so I haven't. But well, it's a great privilege. In fact, I've been following this Royal Society Book Prize for decades, ever since I started my PhD 2 decades ago, more than that now. And I've been in the audience a few times. Did I ever dream of even being shortlisted for it? No, let alone winning it. And it's just a complete honour to win it. Also, I should say at this point that I started working on the adolescent brain about 15 years ago, and it was thanks to the Royal Society that I was able to do that, because I had a series of Royal Society research fellowships, a Dorothy Hodgkin fellowship and then a university research fellowship. And that enabled me to start my lab and work in this field and become an independent researcher known for research in this field. So the Royal Society has made all of this possible, really. And I would like to thank a few people. Now, this I did think of, but did I? And I wrote a few names down. I have no idea where I put that piece of paper with all those names, but anyway, I'll try to remember. So I would like to thank, there are lots and lots of people helped me write this book. I think I mentioned it earlier. Quite a few people read parts of it. A friend of mine, Kathleen Ball, who has a very precise editor's eye, read the whole thing several times. Lucy Folks, my former postdoc, also read it. Lots of people gave me help with various parts of it, like my parents, and Tim Dalgleish, and Pete Etchells, and I'm very grateful to them. I'm enormously grateful to my research group, both current members and former members, because there would be no research to write about if it wasn't for them. I couldn't do this by myself. And they have, all the people that I have worked with, I've been lucky enough to have an amazing team of people. I would like to thank the teenagers who I work with. I work with lots and lots of teenagers, the participants in our studies. I've worked with teenagers in lots of outreach, public engagement activities. And also work experience students come into my lab for a week in the summer. And I think it was probably a year ago, I said, we never quite know what to give these work experiences students to do when they're in the lab. And I was like, I've got a job for you. You can have a look at this manuscript of this book that I've written, lucky you. And they were so helpful, although slightly disheartening when I expected them to say, these are sort of 16-year-old students, and I expected them to say, yeah, I've just got this kind of 2 comments. And one of them was like, right, sit down. I've got pages of comments, criticisms about the way you write about teenagers and that kind of thing. So they were massively helpful, because actually one of the things that you learn in my field is you can't talk about adolescents like they're some kind of different species. That's not the way to think about adolescents. They are us. We were all adolescents once. And finally, I'd like to thank the people who really shaped this book. Will Francis, my agent, also Lucy's agent, and Susanna Wadeson, my editor from Transworld. Susanna is also Lucy's editor, publisher, and Hannah's editor and publisher. So Susanna is somewhere around here, and she obviously does something right. So thank you very much.